Hi, I'm Sam. I'm one of your section leaders in 106A, and I'm going to show you how to use the debugger. The debugger is a tool that Eclipse has that will help you fix bugs and will make your life a lot easier if you learn how to use it early. Before I go through anything else, I'm going to show you some code that we're going to be debugging. The code that we want is going to make a box in the center of the screen, and it's going to be filled. It's going to make another smaller box inside that, and then it's going to draw some lines through the boxes, and everything is going to be centered, and the lines are going to get smaller and smaller as they go down, and it should end somewhere near the bottom. And all of this should be centered vertically, should be centered horizontally, the lines should be centered, the boxes should be centered, you should be able to see everything. And now I'm going to go to Eclipse and show you the actual code. Okay, here's the code. You can see there's a comment at the top, there's some imports, here are some named constants. The ones that are maybe a little bit more complicated have their own comments. And here are the three methods that I'm going to be using, or actually two methods that I'm going to be using, are draw a square. And you can see, because I had a /** comment, that when I hover over draw centered square, I can see exactly what that does. So it adds a square to the screen. The two arguments that it takes are size, which is the length of a side of the square, and color, which is the color of the square. So here, I want this to be a smaller square, so square width over 2. And I want the color to be blue. Here, this is going to be the larger square, and the color is going to be red. Then I'm going to draw the centered lines, and it takes one argument, which is the number of lines, and it's going to draw each centered horizontally and all of them centered vertically, and each of them will get smaller. The amount that they get smaller will be the line length delta, and the amount below each one that each next line is going to be is line step. So now you've seen the code, let's see what it does. As you can see, there are a few things that are wrong with this. First, there aren't two squares, there's only the one. And second, you can see that the lines look a little bit off. The one at the bottom is closer to the bottom of the square than the one at the top, which indicates that it's probably not completely centered. Also, if you count, you'll notice that there are 9 in here, even though I said that there should be 10 in my program. So, first things first, let's explore exactly what is happening in our program using the debugger. It's a good idea to just step through each line of code and see what each line of code is doing when you're using the debugger. That way you can see exactly what your program is doing. When you're debugging, don't think of it as what is my program doing wrong, just think of what is your program doing, and then you can figure out how to make it do what you want. In order to set a breakpoint, double-click on the left over here. Slightly more to the left of where you see the pluses and minuses. So if I want to set a breakpoint in run, then you double-click over there, and you'll see now there's a little blue dot. It might be a little bit more visible if you're not in the method, so there isn't the blue there. So you can see now there's a blue dot on the gray background. And again, this is to the left of where the pluses and minuses are for the methods. What that means is that when I run my program, it's going to stop, and it'll pop up the debugger once it hits this breakpoint. So you can see, if I click run, it'll pop up this really scary message that you might have gotten if your program crashed before, and it'll say this kind of launch is configured to open the debug perspective when it suspends. Here you can just say remember my decision and yes. Now you can see that Eclipse changed the way that it looks from the regular view which you use to write code to the debugging view. You can see that there's some more information here. We'll go over the stuff up here in a little bit, but for now you can see here you are in this part of the screen. You can see a small amount of your code, and you can see a little arrow. That's the line that it is about to execute, and there's also a little dot there, which is your breakpoint, and the line that it's about to execute, in other words, the line with the arrow, is also going to be highlighted in a different color. You can also see that a Java window opened. So if I move my Eclipse window over so that I can't really see anything, and then open my Java window, you can actually see that the Java window is going to be doing exactly what Eclipse is doing. So here, now we're in this view, what do we do with it? All of the tools that you need are going to be up here. So here you can see a play pause button that will resume. Resume usually isn't what you want to do when you're debugging because it will just continue running until it finishes or until it hits another breakpoint. Let's see what it does. So you see, I hit resume and then it gives me exactly what I had before. Not very helpful. So let's stop it. That'll close everything down and run it again. Debug perspective opens again. Move my window over so I can see the debugger. And it's on the same line again, because that's where I put the breakpoint. The tools that you'll mainly be using are these three: step into, step over, and step return. Step over will move one line down in code. If you click it now, you'll see it went from this line to this line. And the line that it is currently on, the line that's highlighted in green right now, that line has not been executed yet. So it goes from this line to this line. You can see that here, it actually is drawing the blue square, but it's not showing up at the end. Huh, weird. If I step again, you can see, oh, this one is drawing the red square, which draws the square over the blue one, which means that I am not able to see the blue one. So that's what our problem is. You can see here, if we make this a little bit bigger, it's drawing the smaller one first and then the larger one, which means that we can't see the smaller one at the end. So the solution to this, just draw the smaller one second. And now if we stop our code and get rid of the breakpoint, and then run it again, and always save before launching, then you can see now you have the red square and the blue square. We still have some issues with our lines, though. Now, if I put the breakpoint here, I know that it's going to be, the bug is going to be in draw-centered lines, but for now, we can just leave a breakpoint and run, and then kind of walk down to draw-centered lines later. So here, let's run it again. What does step into do? Step into does exactly the same thing as step over if you are currently on a line that is not a function. So for instance, if you have a line that just adds two variables, step into will do exactly the same thing as step over. However, if you're on a line that includes any method calls, so for instance here, we're calling the method drawCenteredSquare, when you step into it, instead of just going over and executing that whole method, it'll go into the method. Here you can see it brought us down to drawCenteredSquare, and now we're on the first line of drawCenteredSquare. Since this, what happens if we click step into again? Here you can see that we're making a new grect, and that is actually a method. We get something very scary that says the source is not found. We get a class not found exception. What that's telling us is basically that Eclipse is trying to go into something, but it doesn't have the source code for that, so it can't go into it. So whenever this happens, you can just step return, and you might have to click it a few times if there are a bunch of class not found exceptions, and then eventually it'll get us back. So if we step in, and then go over a few times, then eventually we can just get down, and it'll get to the end of the method, and it'll return to where we were. So if we want to execute draw-centered lines, then we would just say step over, but if we want to actually see what draw-centered lines is doing, then we would have to step into it. You can see here there are some pretty big comments explaining exactly what this is doing. This is a for loop that will go through a bunch of lines and will check them out, and it starts at the first line, it goes until num lines. Num lines is what's passed in, so you can see when I hover over num lines it'll say num lines equals 10. This is another very useful thing about the debugger. When you're in the debugging perspective, you can see what every variable is. So all of the variables are going to show up here, but if you find it easier, you can just hover over and it'll tell you what it is. If you have anything more complicated, so for instance, a line is a variable that holds a line object, a gline. Let's step down. So keep clicking step over until we've executed that line. And now that the line exists, when I hover over it, you can see a bunch of things about it. So you can see a bunch of things that don't really make sense, but you can also see xc and yc and dx and dy. So that probably means the x where the line is starting, or maybe the center x or something like that, and the delta x and delta y. So whenever you have an object, you can hover over it and see more information about it. And you can see that when I click step over, it'll bring me back to the start of the for loop, because this for loop is going to execute multiple times, and it also executed that line, and it added the line over here. And you can see already that this isn't what we wanted to do. So we could just keep clicking step over and watch it draw more lines, but that isn't really telling us anything more, because we know that as of the first line, we already have a problem. And some of you in the audience might notice that here we started our for loop at 1 rather than at 0. And generally in computer science, we think starting at 0, so if we start that at 0, then you can see that everything would work fine. And you can see that our math here, if you want to parse it out and follow what the comment says, all of this assumes that it's starting at 0. So now, if we stop this and run it again, and we don't care about the breakpoint, so we'll just click resume, then we can see that the lines are pretty much centered. There's still one more issue though. When I was drawing on the slides earlier, all of the lines were green. Here, all of the lines are black. Now, I thought that I wrote a method that was actually going to do this correctly. So you can see up here, I have a draw centered lines that takes in a color. Let's set a breakpoint here to see what happens. I'll get rid of the breakpoint inside of run. When I run my code, it never even opens the debugger. What that means is that it never hit that breakpoint. So you can see in my draw centered lines method, there's a breakpoint there, and it is calling draw centered lines, but it's not this draw centered lines. You can see in run that I call draw centered lines 10, and I actually made two different draw centered lines methods. One that only takes the number of lines, and one that takes the number of lines and a color. Because I only gave draw centered lines one argument, it thought that it was referring to this one, so it was making a bunch of black lines rather than a bunch of green lines. And we could see that because I put a breakpoint in this method and found out that the method was never being called. Now you'll notice that this method also has a bunch of yellow squigglies, and that's a warning that Eclipse is doing to say that this line is never used locally. Locally means within your current program. So a lot of times Eclipse will already kind of warn you about things that it thinks are going to be issues, but this is just one place where it's easy to make a mistake. In other words, if you have a method that isn't actually being called, you can just put a breakpoint in it to see if it is in fact being called. So here, if I just change this to 10 and pass in the variable color.green, then everything will work as expected. and we'll be done debugging. So if I save and then run, you can see, but because I had two of the methods, only the first one I fixed the 0 to 1 issue, or 1 to 0 issue. So here, now everything will work pretty much as expected. To recap, when you're in the debugging perspective, you can go over, you can have a code view here, you can set breakpoints on the left, and you can look at any of your variables here. If you want to step through your program, you have to use these keys up here, and you can also use different hotkeys for them. Now, there are two more advanced features that you can use when you're debugging. The first one of them is looking at the stack. You'll learn about the stack more later, but in order to demonstrate, I'll just set a breakpoint inside draw centered lines, and then run. So here we're in draw centered lines, so it hasn't drawn the lines yet, but you can see this whole part up here. Up here, it's saying the main thread hit a breakpoint at line 51. So down here, the current line is line 51. But you can see that the only thing up here isn't just draw centered lines. It also knows about run. And if I click on run, it'll tell me exactly where in run I was before it hit draw centered lines. This is called the stack. This means that it has every different method call in your program, and it keeps track of all of the methods that you were at. So if you kind of want to understand the flow of your program a little bit better, or if you're maybe in a bigger program and you have a bunch of different methods that all call something like draw centered lines, then you can say, oh, this is the draw centered lines that was called from run. This isn't the draw centered lines that was called from some other method. And that can give you a lot of information about what exactly your program is doing. And you can notice when I click on a different stack frame, you can see all of the variables and you can see all of the code from within that stack frame. The next concept is actually executing code. This isn't something that you'll need to do ever, but if you ever want to, it can be extremely useful. So down here, right now I have console and tasks, but let's figure out how to add another thing to down here that'll let us actually execute new code. If we go up to Window, go into Show View, and then go over to Display, and click on it, that'll add something new to the bottom part where the console was. In Display, you can actually give Eclipse code that it'll execute, and that'll actually change the variables that are up here. It'll change the program. So for instance, if I say line num ++, and then I highlight that code in the display, and I go over here and say inspect the result of evaluating selected text, then it'll actually execute that line of code, and it'll say line num ++, and then you can see up here the variable line num changed. That means that if we want to do anything, we can just type out a line of code here and then change it. So right now we see numLines equals 10, but let's say that I'm in the middle of debugging and I find it more useful to only have 5 lines. Then I could say numLines equals 5. Highlight that, and then inspect the result of evaluating selected text, and then it'll evaluate that text, so it'll be as if you inserted the line numLines equals 5 into your code, and then you can see now numLines is 5. And then if I finish running this, if I get rid of the breakpoint and then finish running it, it'll only draw 4 different lines. And to review those last 2 features that we talked about are you can look up here to talk about the stack, and you can look over here for any variables, and when you do something down here, it'll actually change what the variables are up here. That's all to be used in addition to the skills that you have in general of just clicking through up here with step into, step over, and step return, which will let you go through the code, and of setting breakpoints, which will let you stop the code in particular places. And that's all there is to know about Eclipse's debugger. If you want to know some more fancy things, like setting a breakpoint that'll only stop if a certain condition is true, all of that is available, and if you just Google for it, then you can see that there's an extremely large contingent of people who are using Eclipse for their code, and somebody else will probably have written a guide on using some of those more advanced features. I hope you got a lot out of this, and that you'll be using the debugger more in the future. If you have any other questions, then just stop by the lair or ask one of the section leaders or TAs after class, and we can give you some more tips on using the debugger.